Wow, just wow. There is a seismic game of chicken going down right now that could fundamentally change how churches operate in the United States. And it is very easy to get lost in the weeds of inflammatory statements when a pastor calls all Democrats demonic, implies some of his own congregants are witches, burns books, and tells folks to eat his dirty socks on live TV. But what Pastor Greg Locke has publicly stated should force the government to respond. And that response could have massive ramifications for every church in the United States. So let's explore Pastor Greg Locke and his showdown with the IRS. Welcome, explorers. Greg Locke is pastor of Global Vision Bible Church in Mount Juliet outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And I do not think I can understate what the actions of Greg Locke and his church could mean for the future of churches in the United States. In May of this year, Locke stated from his pulpit, quote, "You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat," end quote. He went on to colorfully embellish this quote by stating that Democrats are God deniers, demons, baby butchers, and they hate the United States. And again, it would be easy to focus on such a statement of calling another human being created in the image of God a demon, or begin to respond and refute the extreme statements in the manner in which they were made. But the more historically significant part of these quotes are, "You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat in this country." Now, please note, just because I am focusing on Locke's statements regarding politics and taxes and not his inflammatory language, that is in no way a show of support on my part in what and how Locke is speaking. But that single sentence, "You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat," and Locke's subsequent actions could shape the United States. And this takes us to what is known as the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment was a change in the tax code in 1954 that directly applies to churches. In 1954, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who would go on to be the 36th President of the United States, was running for re-election to the U.S. Senate against Republican Carlos Watson and Constitution candidate Fred Spangler. LBJ won his re-election by a wide margin, raking in over 84% of the vote. But there were some campaign efforts against LBJ that caught his attention. There were two organizations that actively campaigned against LBJ. They were the Facts Forum and the Committee for Constitutional Government. Both of these organizations have two things in common. First, they both used tactics similar to Senator Joseph McCarthy discussing enemies within and accusations of communism. And second, both of these organizations were tax exempt. Specifically, they were 501c3 tax exempt organizations. LBJ did not like that there were tax-exempt organizations that could then be an active lobbying organization working politically to help or hurt various campaigns. He did not think it was appropriate for a nonprofit charitable organization taking a tax exemption to be politically active. Thus, when LBJ re-entered the Senate in 1954, he led the charge to change the tax code. There was an amendment to the tax code that bears his name, known as the Johnson Amendment, that states 501c3 nonprofit organizations cannot campaign, participate, or intervene on behalf or against any political candidate. And even though neither the Facts Forum or the Committee for Constitutional Government were religious institutions, their actions have had lasting impact upon churches, because churches too are 501c3 tax-exempt organization in the United States tax code, which means the Johnson Amendment against political participation applies to churches. The punishment for breaking the Johnson Amendment is the loss of your tax-exempt status. Now, the United States has been slow to investigate or to penalize churches for political engagement. In fact, there have only been a small handful of investigations, and I could only find one instance of the IRS stripping the tax-exempt status of a church. And that church took out a full-page ad in the newspaper back in the 90s campaigning against presidential candidate Bill Clinton. But that church fought in court in an attempt to repeal the IRS decision. And that is steadfastly not what Greg Locke and Global Vision Bible Church has done. First, it is important to note that as of this recording, I could find no confirmation that the IRS has stripped Global Vision Bible Church of their tax exemption or if any new tax code applies to this church. but calls from the public for the IRS to investigate and to strip Global Vision Bible Church of their tax-exempt status have come, and they have come loudly. The Americans United for Separation of Church and State have called for an investigation, along with calls from many, many others. Well, Greg Locke did not wait to see how the IRS would respond to the calls for an investigation. He also did not backtrack or back down from his statement. He stood in his pulpit on Sunday, May 22nd of this year and stated that the church got an attorney and they dissolved their 501c3 status. This message is on both Global Vision Bible Church's YouTube channel and their Facebook page. It was posted on May 22nd, and it is entitled, "Does Jesus Know Who You Are?" And Locke begins to discuss the church and taxes at about the 50-minute mark, and it is amazing. Essentially, Locke stated that Global Vision Bible Church was renouncing their tax-exempt status. So in his mind, Locke will no longer be under the mandate of the Johnson Amendment, and he can stay and say anything political as he wants to. And of course, he throws in some colorful language, challenging some folks to eat his dirty socks. But again, do not miss the direct challenge to the tax code and the IRS itself. Locke did not say the Johnson Amendment is not constitutional and therefore it's unenforceable, which many have said. He did not argue that we can be political because of the First Amendment, which again, many have said. Locke just stated, we don't care about our tax-exempt status. We are going to be political when we feel led to be political. And then there is an interesting phrase thrown in that possibly only I found supremely interesting. Locke said, we got an attorney. And that is a more interesting phrase than I think most will think it is. Who could possibly think we got an attorney is interesting? This nerd. Now, some have argued that Locke is all bluster here and that he would never give up his tax-exempt status because that first tax bill will hit, and that Locke is banking on the fact that the IRS does not like going after churches. And there are dozens of pastors over the years that have endorsed political candidates, and the IRS has not taken away their tax exemptions. Again, I can only find one instant where a church actually lost their tax exemption due to the Johnson Amendment. Please, if there are others, let me know in the comments. But the line, we got an attorney, makes this whole case different. Locke did not say we called our accountant. Locke did not say we called our CPA. He did not even say we called the IRS itself. He said that they obtained the services of an attorney, and that gives this story some serious leg. You see, back in 2015, a portion of the National Football League, the NFL, was a 501c6 tax-exempt organization. Not all the NFL was tax-exempt, each team was taxed, and the vast majority of the NFL's revenue was taxed, but there was a portion of the NFL that was tax-exempt. This required the NFL to disclose certain information, such as the commissioner's gigantic salary. But because of various controversies such as concussions, players abusing women, among other criminal acts, the mistreatment of the players by the NFL, the public began to call for the government to investigate and to act against the NFL. And this tax exemption was a part of the outcry against the NFL. Well, in that same year of 2015, the NFL called this tax exemption a distraction and they gave it up. The portion of the NFL that was 501c6 reclassified into existing tax code for a private trade corporation, and that portion of the NFL began paying taxes in their new place in the tax code. Well, as an avid sports fan, I found that move interesting, and as a pastor, I began to wonder what would happen to a church if they made the same move. What protections, if any, would the church gain? Could a church become a more politically active organization? Would it prevent government intrusion? Now, as a pastor, I do not have a desire to preach politically driven messages. I want to preach gospel-driven messages, but I must admit, I was intellectually curious as to what would happen if a church made a similar decision. So motivated by the NFL's move, I contacted a retired IRS worker who I worshiped with for many, many years. Shout out, Mr. Jim. And I asked Jim, could you look into what would be the ramifications of a church renouncing their tax-exempt status? What protections, if any, would be gained? What would the tax bill be? And off to research Mr. Jim went. Again, he was a retired IRS worker, and I could not wait to hear the results. It was 3 weeks later that Jim and I got together to discuss the fruits of his research, and like all things, this is really complicated. First, you must understand exactly what the NFL did. The portion of the NFL that was a tax-exempt 501c6 did not just announce, "We renounce our tax-exempt status," and then the IRS started sending a tax bill. That would be the equivalent of Michael Scott saying, "I declare bankruptcy." It just does not work that way. So Greg Locke declaring, "We renounce our tax exemption" by itself will not change anything. And also to know about the NFL, there are multiple places within the tax code for businesses to incorporate. So the tax-exempt portion of the NFL reclassified themselves into another non-tax-exempt section of the tax code, governing the type of business that the NFL incorporated under. The NFL switched classifications and immediately began to follow another set of the tax code. So you cannot just renounce a tax exemption, you must reorganize under another section of the tax code. And Jim told me after a good deal of reading and quite a few phone calls that he flatly could not find another section of the tax code where churches could incorporate. Churches only fit as a 501c3 into the tax code. They do not fit the definition or meet the requirements to be a business, an S Corp, an LLC, or anything else. Churches only have one place designed for them in the tax code, and that is 501c3 tax exempt. And Mr. Jim told me to renounce your church's tax exempt status that he believed, after his research, new tax code would have to be written explicitly for the purpose of a non-tax exempt church. He told me that he does not see any way for this to occur without lawyers and bureaucrats working out new tax code. And also, there are absolutely no guarantees that the Johnson Amendment would not apply to a tax-paying church, because when the tax code is written for a tax-paying church, the IRS could just include the Johnson Amendment or other restrictions in the new tax code. So in the end, Jim said, "I don't see any other place for a church within the tax code except as a tax-exempt 501c3, and if a church renounced their tax-exempt status, it would not guarantee any protections like you might think, because Congress could just write the new tax code governing tax-paying churches with similar restrictions." So when Greg Locke announced they got a lawyer instead of an accountant, it makes me think that there just might be a showdown here. That there is a legitimate desire by Global Vision Bible Church to break from the restrictions of the 501c3 tax code, and he wants his church out from underneath the Johnson Amendment. And that this church is not just bellowing loud words challenging the government to respond to their bluster, but that Greg Locke has retained legal services possibly ready to negotiate their new tax standing. Greg Locke has said some controversial statements, and it's easy to get riled up by his inflammatory language. But make no mistake, the phrase, "You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat," followed by, "I got a lawyer and we renounce our tax-exempt status," could be a watershed moment in American church history. Will there be new tax code written? Will churches get the option of choosing to be tax-exempt or not? Will churches gain a new ability to become political instruments? Will the new tax code allow churches to pay taxes but still have political guidelines? Is there a trip to the Supreme Court in the near future? Could we see Christian denominations join political parties? Could we see denominations split over political agenda? And could we just see churches lose the tax-exempt status across the board? And could we see small rural congregations close doors because of a new tax burden? Who knows? How this plays out could fundamentally shift how churches operate in the United States, and I am very interested in seeing how this plays out. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to go look through my receipts, and as always, my bibliography is in the description below. Be blessed.